St. Petersburg, 1894. The Imperial Russian Army faced a problem. Their standard-issue Smith & Wesson Model 3 revolvers, while reliable, represented yesterday's technology. Smokeless powder had revolutionized firearms, and the Tsar's military advisors knew they needed a weapon designed for the modern age. The answer would come from an unlikely source, two Belgian brothers whose previous work on the Russian service rifle had already impressed the military establishment. The Nagant M1895 revolver was about to begin a journey that would span empires, revolutions, 2 world wars, and conflicts on 3 continents, surviving when every logical prediction said it should have disappeared into history. Léon and Émile Nagant were already household names in Russian military circles by the early 1890s. Their contribution to the Mosin-Nagant rifle, adopted in 1891, had established them as innovative designers willing to push the boundaries of conventional firearms engineering. When the Imperial Russian government approached them about developing a new service revolver, the Nagant saw an opportunity to create something truly unique. What they delivered was a weapon that defied the conventions of revolver design with a feature so unusual that firearms historians still debate its practical value over a century later. The Nagant M1895 featured a gas seal system unlike any other mass-produced revolver in history. In conventional revolvers, a small gap exists between the cylinder and the barrel, a mechanical necessity that allows the cylinder to rotate freely. When fired, high-pressure gases escape through this gap, robbing the bullet of velocity and creating that distinctive sharp crack associated with revolvers. The Nagants eliminated this problem with an elegant if complex solution. When the hammer was cocked, the cylinder didn't just rotate, it moved forward, pushing the front of the chamber against a conical section at the rear of the barrel. The proprietary 7.62 by 38mm rimmed cartridge completed the seal. The bullet sat entirely within the cartridge case, with the brass extending beyond the cylinder face. When fired, the case mouth expanded into the barrel's forcing cone, creating a gas-tight seal that captured every bit of propellant energy. The theoretical benefits were impressive. Muzzle velocity increased by approximately 75 feet per second compared to a conventional revolver design. The sealed system eliminated the possibility of injury from escaping gases, a real concern in close-quarters combat. Most significantly, the gas seal meant the Nagant could accept a suppressor, making it one of the only revolvers in history capable of effective sound suppression. These advantages came with substantial trade-offs. The complex mechanism required precise manufacturing, driving up costs. The unique cartridge meant logistics chains had to stock ammunition that worked in no other weapon. Loading and unloading was painfully slow, feeding cartridges, one at a time through a loading gate on the side of the frame and extracting spent cases individually with a rod. The action's mechanical complexity resulted in a trigger pull that modern shooters describe as brutal, 20 pounds in double action, around 12 to 15 pounds even in single action. Imperial Russia adopted the Nagant M1895 in 1895, replacing their aging Smith & Wesson revolvers. Initial production began at Nagant's facility in Liège, Belgium, with the first 20,000 units manufactured there while Russian arsenals retooled their production lines. By 1898, the Tula arsenal had begun domestic production, eventually churning out 20,000 revolvers per year. The Imperial Russian Army created 2 versions that reflected the rigid class distinctions of Tsarist society. Officers received double-action revolvers, capable of being fired by simply pulling the trigger. Enlisted men and non-commissioned officers received single-action models, requiring the hammer to be manually cocked before each shot. The message was clear: officers needed the faster firing capability that double-action provided. Common soldiers could make do with the slower, cheaper single-action design. This class-based distinction would disappear after 1918, but it tells us much about the world the Nagant was born into. The revolver saw its combat debut during the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900, where Russian troops were part of the 8-nation alliance that relieved the besieged legations in Beijing. But its first major test came during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. Russian officers carried the Nagant through the brutal battles of Port Arthur, Mukden, and Tsushima. Field reports praised its reliability in the harsh Manchurian environment. The robust construction and simple mechanism functioned in conditions that caused more delicate weapons to fail. One officer noted that the Nagant could be disassembled and reassembled with minimal tools, that if anything went wrong with it, you could fix it with a hammer. This reputation for rugged dependability would define the weapon throughout its service life. By 1914, when the First World War erupted, over 574,000 Nagant revolvers had been produced. The weapon became a common sight on the Eastern Front, carried by Russian officers leading their men across the vast battlefields of Poland, Galicia, and the Carpathian Mountains. It served through the grinding attritional warfare that characterized the Eastern Front, where battles consumed men and material on a scale that dwarfed anything in previous history. The Nagant's reliability in the brutal Russian winters, where temperatures could drop to -40 degrees, made it particularly valued. While other weapons froze or malfunctioned, the simple mechanism of the Nagant continued to operate. By the time of the Russian Revolution in 1917, approximately 1.05 million Nagant M1895 revolvers had been manufactured. The events of 1917 should have spelled the end for the Nagant revolver. The October Revolution overthrew the Tsarist government, plunging Russia into a brutal civil war that would claim millions of lives. Industrial production collapsed. Skilled workers fled or died. The great arsenals at Tula and Izhevsk fell into chaos. Yet the Nagant not only survived, it thrived. The new Bolshevik government recognized something the Tsarist regime had understood. Russia needed a weapon that was simple to manufacture, easy to maintain, and capable of functioning in the harshest conditions imaginable. The Nagant M1895 checked every box. The Red Army standardized on the double-action version after 1918, eliminating the class distinctions of the Imperial era. Every soldier, regardless of rank, received the same weapon. Production resumed at Tula, and the Nagant became the standard sidearm for Red Army officers, commissars, and the feared Cheka, the Bolshevik secret police. The Russian Civil War from 1917 to 1922 saw Nagant revolvers on both sides of the conflict. Red Army troops carried them. White Russian forces used them. The various nationalist movements and foreign intervention forces that carved up the former Russian Empire encountered them. In the chaos and brutality of the Civil War, the Nagant gained a darker reputation. 7 Nagant revolvers were used in July 1918 to execute Tsar Nicholas Then and his family in Yekaterinburg. The Cheka and its successor organizations, the OGPU and NKVD, made the Nagant their weapon of choice for internal security work. Short-barreled versions appeared for plainclothes agents who needed concealment. The distinctive silhouette became associated with midnight arrests and summary executions. Yet to focus only on this dark chapter misses the larger story. The Nagant was the Soviet Union's standard military sidearm, carried by hundreds of thousands of soldiers and officers who never used it for anything more sinister than training and occasional defensive use. In the 1930s, the Soviet government even turned the Nagant into a symbol of honor. Presentation versions with an embossed red star on the grip became one of the highest awards that could be bestowed on a party member. Receiving a Nagant with the red star meant recognition from the highest levels of Soviet leadership. The weapon had achieved cult status. By the early 1930s, the writing appeared on the wall for the Nagant. Semi-automatic pistols represented the future of handgun design. They offered faster reloading, higher capacity, and easier operation. In 1930, the Soviet Union adopted the Tokarev TT-30, later refined as the TT-33, a Browning-inspired semi-automatic chambered in the powerful 7.62 by 25mm Tokarev cartridge. The TT-33 held 8 rounds in the magazine plus 1 in the chamber, could be reloaded in seconds with a spare magazine, and had a reasonable trigger pull. It was everything the Nagant wasn't. Logic suggested the revolver would be phased out rapidly. Instead, production continued. The Tula arsenal kept making Nagants right alongside the newer Tokarev pistols. Why? The answer lies in the realities of Soviet industry and military planning in the 1930s. The Soviet Union was rapidly industrializing under Stalin's 5-year plans, but resources remained constrained. The Nagant used established production lines and required less sophisticated machining than the Tokarev. The 7.62 by 38mm rimmed cartridge was already stockpiled in massive quantities. Perhaps most importantly, Soviet military planners remembered the lessons of the First World War and the Civil War. Modern weapons were wonderful when they worked, but in the mud, blood, and chaos of actual combat, reliability trumped sophistication. The Nagant worked. It worked when it was covered in mud. It worked when it was frozen solid. It worked when it hadn't been cleaned in months. That reliability was worth preserving. The sport shooting community also embraced the Nagant. In 1923, the Soviet Union held its first championship in sport shooting, with one competition involving shooting Standard Army revolvers at targets at 50 meters. The Nagant's accuracy, despite its heavy trigger pull, made it popular with target shooters. Sport versions chambered in .22 caliber appeared, including the Nagant Model 1926, Model 1953, and various other target models produced through the 1950s. The weapon had found a civilian niche alongside its military role. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, launching Operation Barbarossa, any remaining plans to phase out the Nagant evaporated. The Soviet Union needed every weapon it could produce. The factories at Tula found themselves dangerously close to the front lines as German armies drove deep into Soviet territory. In October 1941, Nagant production was evacuated to the Izhevsk arsenal, further east and safer from German advance. Production figures tell the story of desperation and determination. In 1941 alone, 118,000 Nagant revolvers were manufactured. But the evacuation and re-establishment of production lines caused quality control to suffer. The revolvers produced from 1941 through 1943 often showed cruder finish and looser tolerances than pre-war examples. They worked, but they weren't pretty. When Tula was retaken and production resumed there in early 1943, quality gradually improved, but the war years' Nagants remained distinctly rougher than their Imperial or early Soviet predecessors. The Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called World War II, deployed Nagant revolvers in roles the designers never imagined. Frontline infantry officers carried them as backup weapons. Artillery crews, tankers, and support troops received them as personal defense arms. Partisans fighting behind German lines used them in ambushes and raids. The NKVD issued them to commissars, military police and internal security troops. Photographs from the Eastern Front show Soviet officers brandishing Nagants as they led charges across open ground, the iconic image of the officer with raised pistol urging his men forward into German fire. How many of those officers survived their moment of courage is a question history doesn't answer. The gas seal design that had seemed like a clever engineering solution in 1895 found its true purpose in World War II. The Nagant's ability to accept a suppressor made it uniquely valuable for reconnaissance units, scouts, and special operations troops. The Bramit device, developed by the Mitin brothers, was a suppressor specifically designed for the Nagant. When fitted to a Nagant firing in single-action mode, the combination was remarkably quiet. Soviet reconnaissance troops used suppressed Nagants for silent elimination of sentries. Partisan units employed them for assassinations of German occupation officials. The NKVD found them useful for clandestine operations. The number of suppressed Nagants produced during the war remains classified, but captured examples turned up throughout German-occupied territory, suggesting they saw substantial use. The Germans, for their part, captured large numbers of Nagant revolvers as they advanced into Soviet territory in 1941 and 1942. Wehrmacht troops pressed them into service, particularly after the initial optimism of Barbarossa gave way to the grim reality of grinding attrition on the Eastern Front. German soldiers appreciated the Nagant's reliability, even if they found the trigger pull exhausting and the slow reload frustrating. Some German units even used captured suppressed Nagants for their own covert operations. By the war's end in May 1945, total production of the Nagant M1895 had reached approximately 2 million units. This included all versions from the initial Belgian production in 1895 through the final wartime examples from Tula and Izhevsk. The exact number remains uncertain because wartime chaos destroyed or scattered many production records, but conservative estimates place the total between 2 million and 2.6 million revolvers. Few weapons in history have remained in continuous production for 50 years, spanning the transition from black powder to jet aircraft. The Makarov PM, adopted in 1952, officially replaced the Nagant M1895 as the Soviet Union's standard service pistol. The Makarov was everything a modern military sidearm should be: compact, reliable, easy to manufacture, and firing a cartridge that balanced effectiveness with controllability. The 9x18mm Makarov round gave better terminal performance than the anemic 7.62 by 38mm Nagant cartridge. The Makarov's 8-round magazine and quick reloading made it far more practical for defensive use, yet the Nagant refused to disappear. Soviet arsenals held hundreds of thousands of Nagant revolvers in storage. The massive stocks of 7.62 by 38mm ammunition needed to be used. Most importantly, the Soviet Union's vast territory included remote areas where the latest equipment didn't reach quickly. The Nagant found new roles in these backwaters of Soviet power. Railway security troops carried Nagants into the 1970s. Postal security guards used them until 2003. Bailiff security services in some regions didn't retire their Nagants until 2009. Forest rangers and geological survey teams in Siberia and the Far East found that the revolver's reliability in extreme cold and its simple mechanism that could be repaired with basic tools made it more practical than newer weapons. Reports suggest that even today, in some of the most remote areas of Russia and former Soviet republics, Nagant revolvers remain in limited service. The weapons outlived the empire that adopted them, the revolution that kept them, and the Soviet state that produced them in such quantities. The Nagant M1895 also saw service far beyond Soviet borders. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 saw Nagants carried by Chinese People's Volunteer Army forces and North Korean troops. The massive Soviet military aid to North Korea included substantial numbers of older weapons like the Nagant. When American and United Nations forces overran Chinese and North Korean positions, they captured significant quantities of Nagant revolvers. US intelligence reports from the period note the presence of both Tokarev pistols and older Nagant revolvers among enemy forces. The Vietnam War marked perhaps the Nagant's strangest chapter. Viet Cong guerrillas, armed with whatever weapons Soviet and Chinese sponsors could provide, received old Nagants alongside more modern weapons. The gas seal design found a final purpose in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Vietnamese gunsmiths in clandestine workshops modified Nagant revolvers with improvised suppressors for assassination missions. These weapons proved effective for eliminating South Vietnamese officials and American advisors in urban areas where gunfire would alert security forces. The CIA recovered several suppressed Nagants during the war, and at least one example sits in the CIA Museum at Langley, Virginia, a silent testament to the weapon's adaptability. The technical specifications of the Nagant M1895 seem almost quaint by modern standards. The revolver measured 230mm in overall length with its 4.5-inch barrel. It weighed 1.75 pounds unloaded, about 800 grams. The 7-shot cylinder provided one more round than most contemporary revolvers, a small advantage that occasionally mattered. The 7.62 by 38mm rimmed cartridge pushed a 108-grain bullet to approximately 100 feet per second with military loads, generating about 290 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. Commercial ammunition ran cooler, typically around 750 feet per second. These were not impressive numbers even in 1895. The cartridge delivered roughly the same energy as a .32 S&W long, adequate for defense at close range but far from powerful. The gas seal system added that theoretical 75 feet per second, but this modest increase came at the cost of mechanical complexity and manufacturing difficulty. The trigger pull remains the Nagant's most notorious feature. 20 pounds in double action means most shooters must use 2 hands to pull the trigger, making quick aimed fire nearly impossible. Even the 12 to 15 pound single action pull requires deliberate effort. Modern shooters accustomed to crisp 4-pound triggers find the Nagant exhausting to shoot accurately. Yet this heavy pull served a purpose in military service. It made accidental discharge less likely, an important consideration when nervous soldiers carried loaded weapons in close quarters. The heavy pull also meant the weapon was nearly impossible to fire if dropped. Safety through mechanical difficulty was the design philosophy, and it worked. Loading the Nagant required patience. The shooter opened the loading gate on the right side of the frame, exposing one chamber at a time. 7 cartridges meant 7 separate actions, rotating the cylinder after each one. Unloading was worse. The ejector rod, which normally nestled under the barrel, swung out on a pivot to align with the second chamber from the top on the right side. The shooter pushed each empty case out individually, rotating the cylinder 6 more times to clear all 7 chambers. In training, soldiers could accomplish a full reload in about 90 seconds if they worked carefully. Under stress, in combat conditions, reloading took even longer. Compare this to a contemporary Colt or Smith & Wesson revolver with a swing-out cylinder where the shooter could dump all 6 empty cases with one push of the ejector rod and reload in seconds, and the Nagant's obsolescence becomes obvious. Why then did it succeed? The answer lies in understanding what success meant for a military sidearm in the early 20th century. Sidearms have always been secondary weapons for soldiers. The rifle or machine gun wins battles. The pistol or revolver serves as a badge of rank for officers, a last-ditch defensive weapon, and a tool for close-quarters combat where rifles prove unwieldy. The Nagant excelled in these roles because it worked, consistently and reliably, in conditions that destroyed other weapons. Russian and Soviet soldiers encountered environmental extremes that tested equipment beyond normal limits. Winters in Russia and Siberia could freeze weapons solid. Summers in Central Asia subjected equipment to dust storms and temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The spring Rasputitsa, the mud season, turned roads into quagmires and coated everything in thick, clinging muck. The Nagant functioned through all of it. The mechanical simplicity meant soldiers could maintain and repair their weapons with minimal training and basic tools. The robust construction tolerated abuse that would damage more refined weapons. The sealed cylinder actually provided an advantage in dusty environments, preventing grit from entering the action through the cylinder gap. The solid frame design was stronger than break-top revolvers and less prone to timing problems than weapons with side-swinging cylinders. These practical advantages mattered more than speed of reloading or trigger pull weight to soldiers fighting for survival. The Nagant's longevity also reflected the conservative nature of military organizations. Weapons that work acquire institutional inertia. Training programs are built around them. Logistics chains stock their ammunition. Armorers learn to maintain and repair them. Replacing an established weapon means retraining hundreds of thousands of soldiers, retooling factories, establishing new supply chains, and accepting the risks that come with unproven equipment. Militaries make these changes when forced by clear battlefield necessity or overwhelming technological advantage. The Tokarev offered advantages over the Nagant, but not enough to justify completely eliminating a weapon that worked well enough. The philosophy of, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, kept Nagants in service long after more modern weapons appeared. The post-World War II era saw the Soviet Union refurbish existing Nagant stocks for continued use. In the 1970s, Soviet arsenals overhauled thousands of Nagant revolvers, replacing worn parts and refinishing the metal. A final production run of 7.62 by 38mm ammunition ensured these refurbished weapons could remain functional for decades. The revolvers then went into strategic reserve storage, maintained in Kosmolin against an uncertain future. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many of these stored weapons flooded onto the international military surplus market. American gun collectors snapped up Nagants for prices between $80 and $150. Surplus ammunition, often corrosive but functional, sold for reasonable prices. A whole generation of American shooters discovered the strange Russian revolver with the bizarre gas seal mechanism and brutal trigger pull. Collectors prize pre-1918 Tsarist-era Nagants, particularly single-action examples, which are rare because most were converted to double-action after the Revolution. Pre-revolutionary Nagants often show better fit and finish than Soviet-era examples, with more careful machining and higher quality metal finishing. The Tsarist double-headed eagle markings make them historically significant. Soviet-era presentation models with the Red Star are also highly collectible, though their dark associations with Stalin's purges and NKVD activities make them controversial. Shooting a Nagant today is an exercise in historical appreciation rather than practical marksmanship. The heavy trigger pull demands concentration and strong fingers. The modest power of the 7.62 by 38mm cartridge produces light recoil but also limited effectiveness. Accuracy at 15 to 25 yards is acceptable if the shooter can master the trigger. Beyond 25 yards, the combination of crude sights and heavy trigger make precise shooting difficult. The slow reloading process means shooters burn through ammunition at a leisurely pace, which at least saves money. Finding original 7.62 by 38mm ammunition has become challenging, with prices ranging from 50 cents to $1 per round or more. Some shooters use aftermarket cylinders that allow the Nagant to fire more common 32 ACP or .32 H&R Magnum cartridges, though this eliminates the gas seal that makes the design unique. The Nagant M1895 occupies a unique place in firearms history as one of the last successful revolver designs to see extended military service. After World War II, semi-automatic pistols completely dominated military and police service. The revolver survived only as a civilian weapon for sport shooting and personal defense or as a police backup gun. Military forces around the world retired their revolvers in favor of semi-autos with their higher capacity, faster reloading, and easier operation. The Nagant's survival into the 21st century, even in limited roles, marks it as the end of an era. From a purely technical standpoint, the gas seal system was more clever than useful. The modest velocity increase of 75 feet per second didn't translate into noticeably better terminal performance. The sealed cylinder prevented gas escape, but this was never a significant problem with conventional revolvers. The ability to suppress the weapon was genuinely unique, but practical only in specific circumstances for specialized troops. The mechanical complexity, manufacturing difficulty, and slow reloading far outweighed the theoretical benefits of gas sealing. Yet the Nagants persisted in creating this system, and the Russian and Soviet militaries valued it enough to produce 2 million revolvers with this feature. Why? The answer may be that the gas seal was never really the point. The Nagant M1895 succeeded because it was a solid, reliable revolver that happened to have an unusual mechanism. The gas seal made it distinctive, gave it a unique capability for suppressed use, and perhaps appealed to the military mind that values innovation even when the practical benefits are marginal. But the weapon's real virtues were conventional: robust construction, simple mechanism, reliable function in harsh environments, and ease of maintenance. These attributes would have made the Nagant successful even without the gas seal. The unusual feature just made it memorable. The human cost of the Nagant's long service is impossible to calculate. How many soldiers carried it into battle across 2 world wars and countless smaller conflicts? How many pulled its trigger in anger, fear, or cold calculation? The weapon served in some of the bloodiest conflicts in human history. It was present at Port Arthur, Verdun, Stalingrad, the Yalu River, and the Mekong Delta. It witnessed the fall of the Tsars, the rise of the Soviets, and the Cold War confrontations that brought the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation. Nagant revolvers executed prisoners in cellars beneath the Lubyanka. They defended desperate soldiers in the ruins of Stalingrad. They killed and saved, oppressed and liberated, depending on whose hand held them. In the end, the Nagant M1895 survived because it was good enough. Not the best, not the most powerful, not the fastest to reload, or the easiest to shoot accurately. Good enough to work when working mattered. Good enough to be manufactured by the tens of thousands when industrial capacity was strained to the breaking point. Good enough to function when other weapons failed. Good enough to remain in service for over a century, outliving the empire that adopted it, the revolution that kept it, and the Soviet state that made it famous. How many weapons in history can claim they were good enough to span the gap from the age of sail to the space age? The last chapter of the Nagant story is still being written. In conflicts in Ukraine, in Chechnya, in various frozen conflicts across the former Soviet Union, these old revolvers occasionally appear. Photos surface on social media showing soldiers or militia members carrying Nagants pulled from storage or family collections. They're anachronisms, museum pieces pressed back into service because in desperate times, any weapon is better than no weapon. The sight of a Nagant M1895 in 21st century combat serves as a reminder that warfare doesn't always use the latest technology. Sometimes it uses what's available, what's reliable, what your grandfather used and your father before you. The Nagant M1895 is a historical artifact, a mechanical curiosity, a surprisingly successful design that defied expectations and logical predictions for over 100 years. It represents an era when revolvers were serious military weapons, when mechanical ingenuity could compensate for limited industrial capacity, and when a weapon's ability to simply work under the worst conditions mattered more than any other attribute. In museums and collections around the world, Nagants sit silent, their mechanisms frozen, their gas seal systems no longer cycling, their heavy triggers unpulled. But they survived. Against all odds, through revolutions and world wars, Through ideological upheavals and technological transformations, they survived. That alone makes them worthy of remembrance and respect. The Soviet Nagant Revolver didn't just survive. It endured, persisted, and ultimately outlasted almost everything and everyone from its era. In the end, for a tool of war, survival might be the greatest victory of all. The question of why the Nagant remained in production for so long after superior alternatives became available requires deeper examination. The Soviet industrial system operated under fundamentally different principles than Western capitalist economies. In the West, obsolete products disappeared quickly as companies sought competitive advantages through innovation. In the Soviet-planned economy, production decisions reflected state priorities that often valued different metrics than pure performance. The Nagant represented sunk costs in tooling, training, and ammunition stockpiles. Soviet planners calculated that continuing Nagant production alongside newer weapons made economic sense. The revolvers required less advanced machining than semi-automatic pistols. A factory worker with basic training could assemble Nagants. Tokarev pistols demanded more skilled labour and tighter tolerances. During the desperate years of World War II, this difference mattered enormously. The ammunition situation also played a crucial role. By 1941, Soviet arsenals held tens of millions of 7.62 by 38 mm rimmed cartridges. This ammunition had been manufactured continuously since the 1890s. The production infrastructure existed, the quality control procedures were established, and the logistics networks knew how to handle it. Creating new ammunition types meant building new production lines, training new workers, and establishing new distribution systems. In a nation fighting for survival against Nazi invasion, such changes carried enormous opportunity costs. Better to keep making what you knew how to make, even if newer alternatives offered marginal improvements. The Nagant's continued production wasn't irrational, it was pragmatic resource allocation under conditions of extreme stress. The suppressor capability deserves special attention because it represents one of the few instances where the Nagant's gas seal system provided genuine tactical advantages. Most revolvers cannot be effectively suppressed because gases escaping through the cylinder gap create noise regardless of any barrel-mounted suppressor. The Nagant's sealed system eliminated this escape, allowing effective sound suppression when fitted with devices like the Brumit suppressor. Soviet Special Operations units recognized this capability early. During the Winter War against Finland in 1939 to 1940, Soviet reconnaissance troops used suppressed Nagants for silent elimination of Finnish sentries. The weapons proved effective in the dense forests of Karelia, where sound carried long distances and alerting enemy positions could prove fatal. The Great Patriotic War expanded suppressed Nagant use dramatically. Soviet partisan units operating behind German lines received suppressed Nagants for assassination missions against German occupation officials, collaborators, and high-value military targets. The NKVD's Special Tasks units employed them for similar purposes. German counterintelligence reports from 1942 and 1943 document concern about Soviet agents using silenced weapons in urban areas. Several reports specifically mention revolvers, almost certainly Nagants, used in attacks on German personnel in occupied cities. The psychological impact of these silent weapons exceeded their tactical effectiveness. German soldiers grew paranoid about silent killers stalking them, affecting morale in rear areas that should have been safe. Post-war, suppressed Nagants found new roles in Soviet security services. The KGB maintained stocks of suppressed revolvers for wet work operations abroad. Defector testimony and declassified documents suggest these weapons saw use in various Cold War assassinations and covert operations. The advantage of a revolver for such work lay in its mechanical simplicity and lack of ejected cartridge cases that could provide forensic evidence. A revolver kept its empty cases in the cylinder, which the assassin could carefully remove and dispose of later. Semi-automatic pistols ejected cases that might be left at crime scenes, potentially linking the weapon to other operations. For intelligence services, these operational security considerations mattered greatly. The Nagant's role in Soviet law enforcement and internal security created complex legacies that persist today. The weapon became synonymous with state repression during Stalin's purges of the 1930s. NKVD interrogators and executioners carried Nagants as they implemented the Great Terror that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. The sound of a Nagant being cocked became associated with imminent death in the basements of Lubyanka prison and countless other detention facilities across the Soviet Union. Survivors of Stalin's camps recalled the distinctive heavy click of the Nagant's hammer being drawn back as one of the most terrifying sounds imaginable. This dark association has never fully left the weapon. In Russia and former Soviet states, the Nagant carries psychological weight beyond its mechanical characteristics. Yet focusing only on this sinister history ignores the millions of Soviet citizens who carried Nagants in legitimate defense of their nation. Red Army officers led desperate defensive battles against Nazi invasion with Nagants on their hips. Soviet tankers used them as emergency weapons when their vehicles were disabled. Artillery crews defended their guns with Nagants when German infantry overran positions. Partisan fighters harassed German supply lines with whatever weapons they could acquire, often including Nagants. For these soldiers, the revolver was simply a tool that might save their lives in desperate circumstances. The weapon itself was morally neutral. Human choices about its use created the moral dimensions. The technical evolution of the Nagant during its long production run reveals how manufacturing priorities shifted over decades. Pre-revolutionary Nagants from Tula and the Belgian Nagant factory show excellent fit and finish. Metal surfaces were carefully polished. Machining marks were minimal. The actions were precisely fitted. Grips were well-finished wood, properly shaped and smoothed. These weapons represented quality craftsmanship in an era when skilled workers took pride in their output. The Russian imperial arsenal markings included the Tsar's double-headed eagle, production year and inspector marks. Each revolver was an individual product checked by named inspectors who took responsibility for quality. Soviet-era production showed gradual changes in manufacturing philosophy. Early, Soviet Nagants from the 1920s maintained reasonable quality standards, though finish quality declined slightly compared to imperial examples. The focus shifted from appearance to function. Did the weapon work reliably? That was what mattered. Cosmetic finish became less important. By the 1930s, Nagants showed distinctly more utilitarian manufacture. Machining marks were left visible, metal finishing was adequate but not polished. Grips were functional but roughly shaped. Soviet markings replaced Tsarist eagles with stars, hammers and sickles, and production codes identifying manufacturing plants and years. The wartime emergency production from 1941 to 1943 created Nagants that bordered on crude. Finish was minimal, often just basic bluing that wore quickly. Machining showed tool marks and rough surfaces. Grips were roughly shaped wood that splintered easily. Tolerances loosened, resulting in actions with more play and less precise timing. These weapons functioned, but they represented desperate industrial output from a nation fighting for survival. Every skilled worker who could be spared went to producing tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The workers who remained did their best with whatever materials were available. That these wartime Nagants worked at all testifies to the fundamental soundness of the basic design. Even when manufactured under terrible conditions with minimal quality control, they still functioned reliably enough for military service. Post-war production quality improved, but never fully returned to pre-war standards. The Soviet Union prioritized rapid production over refinement across its entire industrial base. Nagants made in the late 1940s and early 1950s showed better finish than wartime examples, but remained distinctly utilitarian. The last Nagants produced before production ended showed adequate workmanship that met military specifications without exceeding them. Soviet manufacturing philosophy valued reliability and producibility over refinement. A weapon that worked perfectly and looked rough was better than one that looked beautiful but failed in combat. The ammunition evolution parallels the weapon's story. The original 7.62 by 38mm rimmed cartridge used a 108-grain lead bullet, driven by approximately 21 grains of smokeless powder. Early loadings used various smokeless powders as manufacturers experimented with formulations. By World War I, standardized military loadings had emerged using ball powder that provided consistent velocities around 1,000 feet per second. The cartridge case design was unique, extending beyond the bullet to facilitate the gas seal. This meant the loaded cartridge was longer than typical revolver rounds, contributing to the Nagant's slow loading process. Each cartridge had to be carefully aligned as it entered the chamber. World War II created ammunition shortages that forced the Soviets to produce 7.62 by 38mm rounds with whatever materials were available. Quality varied enormously. Some wartime ammunition used steel cases instead of brass to conserve copper. Primers were sometimes corrosive formulations that, while reliable, caused rust if weapons weren't cleaned promptly. Powder charges varied, resulting in inconsistent velocities. Soldiers learned to expect some cartridges to be louder than others, some to produce more recoil. As long as the ammunition fired reliably and the bullets left the barrel, Soviet quartermasters considered it acceptable. Peacetime production improved consistency, but Soviet ammunition never achieved the tight tolerances Western manufacturers maintained. For military purposes, this didn't matter. The weapons functioned, and soldiers could hit man-sized targets at defensive distances. The sporting variants of the Nagant represent a fascinating sidebar to the military story. Soviet authorities encouraged sport shooting as a way to maintain marksmanship skills in the civilian population. Nagants were adapted for target shooting in the 1920s and remained popular throughout the Soviet era. The Model 1926 Sport Nagant featured a longer barrel, adjustable sights, and a somewhat lighter trigger pull. It fired standard military ammunition, but could also use specially loaded target rounds, with reduced powder charges for more pleasant shooting. These sport Nagants were well made compared to military examples, reflecting the Soviet Union's emphasis on international sporting success as propaganda. Soviet shooters achieved remarkable accuracy with these weapons despite the heavy trigger pulls. Training methods emphasized smooth trigger control and consistent grip. Shooters learned to stage the trigger in double action, taking up slack before applying final pressure. In single action, they developed finger strength to control the heavy pull without disturbing aim. At 25 meters, skilled Soviet sport shooters could group shots within 2 inches using Nagant target revolvers, impressive accuracy given the weapon's limitations. These sport shooters represented the Soviet Union in international competitions, using Nagants to demonstrate socialist superiority in yet another arena of Cold War competition. The Nagant's appearance in popular culture has been limited compared to more famous firearms. Western films and television shows rarely featured them because they looked unfamiliar to audiences accustomed to Colt and Smith and Wesson revolvers. Soviet films occasionally showed them in historical dramas about the Revolution or World War II, but even Soviet filmmakers often substituted more photogenic weapons. The Nagant's chunky appearance and strange proportions didn't photograph as dramatically as sleeker revolvers. In video games, the Nagant appears occasionally as a World War II-era weapon, usually portrayed with exaggerated negative characteristics, like impossibly slow reloading and weak damage. These portrayals reflect the weapon's reputation among modern shooters who judge it by contemporary standards rather than understanding its historical context. The collector market for Nagants has evolved considerably since the 1990s, when surplus examples first flooded Western markets. Early imports sold for $80 to $100, making them among the cheapest military surplus handguns available. Collectors bought them out of curiosity about the unusual gas seal mechanism or as inexpensive examples of Russian military history. As supplies dwindled, prices increased. By 2010, decent Nagants cost $150 to $200. Today, prices range from $250 to $400, depending on condition and vintage. Pre-revolutionary Nagants with Tsarist markings command premiums, sometimes exceeding $1,000 for exceptional examples. Soviet presentation models with Red Star grips sell for similar prices when they appear on the market. Condition varies enormously among surplus Nagants. Some show minimal wear, having spent decades in storage after minimal use. Others are well-worn service weapons showing holster wear, handling marks and signs of hard use. Refurbished examples often have mismatched serial numbers where worn parts were replaced during overhaul. Collectors debate whether matching numbers matter for Nagants, given that the Soviets routinely mixed parts during arsenal refurbishment. Purists insist on matching numbers and original finish. Practical collectors accept that Soviet refurbishment was part of the weapon's history, and don't penalize mismatched parts if the revolver is otherwise sound. The ammunition situation has become problematic for modern Nagant owners. Original military surplus 7.62 by 38mm ammunition was cheap and plentiful in the 1990s and early 2000s. Cases of spam cans containing hundreds of rounds sold for modest prices. Most of this ammunition used corrosive primers, requiring prompt cleaning after shooting, but it functioned reliably. As supplies were exhausted, prices climbed. Modern commercial ammunition is available from several manufacturers, but costs significantly more than surplus ammunition did. Current prices range from 50 cents to over $1 per round, making recreational shooting expensive. Some shooters hand-load their own ammunition, but the unusual cartridge dimensions and specialized dies required make this a niche pursuit. The scarcity and cost of ammunition has turned many Nagants into safe queens, admired but seldom fired. Converting Nagants to fire more common cartridges has become a minor cottage industry. Aftermarket cylinders chambered for 32 ACP allow shooters to use widely available ammunition. These conversions eliminate the gas seal since 32 ACP cartridges don't protrude from the cylinder face, but they make the weapons more practical to shoot. Other conversions use 32 H&R Magnum, which offers better ballistics than the original 7.62 by 38mm round. Purists object to these conversions as destroying historical artifacts. Practical shooters argue that a Nagant that gets shot with common ammunition serves its purpose better than one that sits unused because original ammunition costs too much. The debate reflects broader questions in the collecting community about preservation versus use. The Nagant's influence on subsequent revolver design was minimal. The gas seal system was never adopted by other manufacturers or militaries. Its complexity didn't justify the modest performance improvements. Modern revolver design evolved along different paths, emphasizing swing-out cylinders for rapid loading, double-action triggers with reasonable pull weights, and more powerful cartridges. The Nagant represented an evolutionary dead end, an interesting idea that didn't propagate. Its survival despite this technical obsolescence makes it historically significant. The weapon succeeded not because it influenced future designs, but because it adequately served the needs of the militaries that adopted it. Comparing the Nagant to contemporary revolvers reveals its strengths and weaknesses in context. The Colt M1901 semi-automatic pistol, adopted by the United States in 1911, fired a 45 ACP cartridge, generating nearly 400 foot-pounds of energy, significantly more powerful than the Nagant's 7.62 by 38mm round. The M1911 held 7 rounds plus 1 in the chamber and could be reloaded in seconds with a fresh magazine. It offered a relatively good trigger pull and was reasonably accurate. The Nagant couldn't compete on any of these metrics, yet the M1911 was a complex machine requiring skilled armourers to maintain. Its tight tolerances made it sensitive to dirt and poor maintenance. In the mud and filth of trench warfare, M1911 sometimes failed when dirty or frozen. The Nagant kept working. The British Webley revolver, standard issue for Commonwealth forces through both World Wars, provides a more direct comparison. The Webley fired a 455 or 38 caliber cartridge from a 6-round cylinder. Its break-top design allowed simultaneous ejection of all empty cases and rapid reloading. The double-action trigger pull was heavy but manageable. The Webley was robust, reliable, and well-suited to military service. Compared to the Webley, the Nagant offered 1 extra round in its cylinder, but was harder to load and reload. The Webley was arguably a better military revolver in practical terms, yet the Nagant matched it in reliability and longevity of service, suggesting that multiple design approaches could succeed given appropriate manufacturing and logistical support. The German Luger P08, iconic pistol of 2 world wars, represented cutting-edge semi-automatic design. Its toggle lock action was complex but functional. The 9 by 19mm parabellum cartridge it fired became one of the most successful pistol cartridges in history. The Luger was accurate, well-balanced, and prestigious. It was also expensive to manufacture, sensitive to dirt, and required careful maintenance. German soldiers often preferred captured revolvers in Eastern Front combat because they were simpler and more reliable in harsh conditions. The Nagant's crude simplicity proved advantageous when technical sophistication became a liability. These comparisons illustrate that weapons don't succeed or fail based purely on technical specifications. Context matters enormously. The best weapon for Swiss target shooters differs from the best weapon for soldiers fighting in Stalingrad's ruins. The Nagant was optimized, perhaps inadvertently, for the specific conditions of Russian and Soviet military service. Extreme environmental conditions, limited maintenance, uncertain logistics, and the need to function despite neglect and abuse. In this context, the Nagant's heavy construction, simple mechanism and robust design made it competitive with technically superior weapons that failed when conditions became harsh. The training requirements for the Nagant shaped how Soviet forces employed it. New recruits learned to field strip and reassemble the weapon until they could do it blindfolded. The process was straightforward. Remove the cylinder pin, extract the cylinder, disassemble the trigger mechanism if necessary. Reassembly was the reverse process. Unlike complex semi-automatic pistols with multiple springs, slides and recoil mechanisms, the Nagant's revolver simplicity meant even poorly educated conscripts could maintain their weapons. Soviet training emphasized functional competence over marksmanship refinement. Soldiers learned to hit torso-sized targets at 15 to 25 meters, adequate for defensive use. Extensive marksmanship training was reserved for designated marksmen and snipers who used rifles. For handguns, basic functional proficiency sufficed. Officers received more extensive pistol training, reflecting their greater likelihood of needing sidearms in combat. Soviet doctrine expected officers to lead from the front, advancing with their men during attacks. The pistol served as a symbol of authority and a last-ditch defensive weapon. Some Soviet officers became skilled pistol shots through practice and personal interest, but institutional training focused on leadership and tactics rather than advanced handgun skills. The Nagant's heavy trigger pull limited how accurate even dedicated shooters could become. Accepting this limitation, Soviet trainers emphasized close-range defensive shooting, where the heavy trigger mattered less than quick presentation and adequate point shooting. The Nagant's role in execution and assassination deserves examination despite its uncomfortable nature. Every military sidearm has been used for summary executions and war crimes. The Nagant's association with Soviet political repression makes this aspect particularly prominent in its history. During Stalin's purges, NKVD personnel used Nagants to execute thousands of accused enemies of the state. The basement execution chambers beneath NKVD headquarters developed systematic processes. Victims were brought down individually, often convinced they were being moved to another facility. A sudden shot to the back of the head from a Nagant ended their lives before they understood what was happening. The efficiency of this horror was deliberate. The Nagant's reliability ensured the weapons functioned even when executing dozens of victims sequentially. This history cannot be ignored or excused. The Nagant became a tool of mass murder during some of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Acknowledging this doesn't mean the weapon itself was evil. Inanimate objects lack moral agency, but it requires recognizing that the Nagant's history includes profound tragedy alongside its military service. The soldiers who carried Nagants in legitimate combat were not responsible for the crimes committed by secret police using the same weapon. Both histories exist simultaneously, complicating how we understand and remember this firearm. The ergonomics of the Nagant reflect its 19th century design origins. The grip angle is steeper than modern revolvers, requiring adjustment for shooters accustomed to contemporary handguns. The grip panels are small by modern standards, making the weapon feel less secure in hand than revolvers with larger grips. The trigger reach is long, challenging for shooters with small hands. The hammer spur is prominent, sometimes biting the web of the shooter's hand during recoil. Modern ergonomic principles emphasize fitting weapons to human hands. The Nagant came from an era when soldiers adapted to their weapons rather than weapons adapting to soldiers. By contemporary standards, it's uncomfortable to shoot. For its era, it was typical. The sights deserve particular mention as examples of early 20th century handgun sight technology. The front sight is a simple blade, non-adjustable and often crudely finished. The rear sight is a notch cut into the top of the frame. No adjustment for windage or elevation existed on standard military Nagants. Sport versions featured adjustable sights, but combat weapons had fixed sights regulated at the factory for a specific range, typically 25 meters. If a particular revolver shot high, low, or to one side, the soldier either learned to compensate or filed the front sight to adjust point of impact. Modern pistol sights with high visibility dots, adjustable mechanisms, and scientifically designed sight pictures make the Nagant's crude sights seem primitive. Yet these simple sights worked well enough for defensive purposes at close range. The holsters issued with Nagants evolved over the weapon's service life. Imperial Russian military holsters were leather, typically brown or black, designed to carry the weapon securely on a belt. Early Soviet holsters continued this pattern. though quality varied based on leather availability and manufacturing priorities. World War II created leather shortages that forced Soviet quartermasters to issue canvas holsters, cheaper and easier to produce but less durable. Post-war holsters returned to leather but remained utilitarian. Soviet holster design prioritized security over quick access. The weapons were carried with the loading gate facing inward and secured with a flap that closed over the entire holster top. Drawing required unfastening the flap, gripping the revolver and pulling it clear. This wasn't fast, but it ensured the weapon wouldn't fall out during physical activity. The Nagant's continued service into the 21st century in limited roles demonstrates the ultimate triumph of adequate reliability over optimal performance. When Russia's Federal Bailiff Service finally retired its last Nagants in 2009, the weapons had been in continuous service for 114 years. No other handgun design can claim such longevity, even accounting for periods when Nagant sat in storage rather than active use. The sheer span of time from adoption to final retirement exceeds every other military handgun. The Colt single-action army served from 1873 until the 1890s in primary US military use, about 20 years. The Colt M1911 served from 1911 until 1985, 74 years. The Nagant outlasted them all. This longevity resulted from several factors converging. The robust design tolerated long-term storage and continued functioning after decades of neglect. The massive production numbers meant replacement weapons were always available. The unique ammunition, while a logistical burden, also meant the weapons couldn't simply be discarded while ammunition stocks existed. The conservative nature of Soviet bureaucracy resisted change unless absolutely necessary. Remote areas of the Soviet Union and successor states had limited access to modern weapons, making continued use of old but functional Nagants pragmatic. None of these factors alone explains the Nagant's survival, but together they created conditions where retirement kept being postponed. The modern shooting sports community has developed an appreciation for the Nagant as a historical curiosity and mechanical oddity. Cowboy action shooting competitors occasionally use Nagants in categories allowing military revolvers. The slow reloading becomes part of the challenge. Bullseye competition shooters have experimented with Nagants, though the heavy trigger pull handicaps accuracy compared to purpose-built target pistols. Some competitive shooters have worked over Nagant actions, polishing contact surfaces and adjusting springs to reduce trigger pull weight. These modified Nagants can achieve surprisingly good accuracy, though they're far from competitive with modern target revolvers. The effort required to make a Nagant competitive exceeds any rational cost-benefit analysis, making such projects labours of love rather than practical endeavours. The YouTube shooting community has produced numerous videos about Nagants, introducing the weapon to new generations. These videos typically emphasise the unusual gas seal mechanism, demonstrate the heavy trigger pull, and note the slow reloading. Most conclude that while the Nagant is interesting historically, it's not particularly enjoyable to shoot. A few defenders argue that understanding the historical context makes shooting a Nagant meaningful as a connection to past events. These competing perspectives reflect broader debates about military surplus firearms. Are they historical artifacts to be preserved and studied, or are they tools meant to be used and enjoyed? The Nagant, like many surplus weapons, exist uncomfortably between these categories. The technical analysis of the gas seal system continues to fascinate engineers and firearms designers. The system functions through precise timing and dimensional tolerances. As the hammer is cocked, a cam mechanism pushes the cylinder forward approximately 3 mm. The chambers are slightly tapered at their fronts to mate with a corresponding taper in the barrel's forcing cone. When fired, the cartridge case expands under pressure, creating a gas-tight seal against both the chamber walls and the barrel cone. The engineering required to make this system function reliably with manufacturing technology from the 1890s was considerable. Modern CAD analysis of the mechanism reveals how carefully the Nagants designed the cam profiles and dimensional relationships. Yet this engineering sophistication produced minimal practical benefit. The velocity increase of 75 feet per second translated to perhaps 20 additional foot-pounds of energy at the muzzle. This might penetrate slightly better or expand marginally more reliably, but the difference was too small to matter in practical combat. The sealed cylinder prevented gas escape injuries, but such injuries were rare with conventional revolvers anyway. The suppressor capability was genuinely useful, but needed by only a tiny fraction of troops. The engineering effort invested in the gas seal system could have been directed toward improving other aspects of the weapon that mattered more for typical users. This represents a common pattern in firearms development: clever engineering solutions to problems that don't significantly affect real-world performance. The comparison between the Nagant M1895 and the Smith & Wesson Model 3, which it replaced in Russian service, illuminates what Russian military planners valued. The Model 3 fired a more powerful .44 Russian cartridge, offered faster reloading through its break-top design, and was manufactured by one of the world's premier firearms companies. Why replace it with the less powerful, slower-loading Nagant? The answer lies in manufacturing and logistics. The Model 3 was imported, making Russia dependent on a foreign supplier. The Nagant could be manufactured domestically at Tula. The smokeless powder cartridge represented modern technology that the old black powder .44 Russian couldn't match. The gas seal system offered theoretical advantages even if practical benefits were limited. National pride and industrial self-sufficiency mattered as much as pure performance metrics. The Nagant story ultimately exemplifies how military weapons succeed through adequacy rather than excellence. Perfect is the enemy of good enough in military procurement. A weapon that works reliably, can be manufactured in quantity, and serves adequately is better than a superior design that's expensive, complex, or difficult to produce. The Nagant worked well enough. It functioned in conditions that destroyed more refined weapons. It could be made by the tens of thousands using available manufacturing technology. It served the roles required of a military sidearm without excelling at any of them. This combination of adequacy across multiple dimensions created success, where excellence in any single dimension would have been insufficient. Military history is full of adequate weapons that succeeded, and excellent weapons that failed, because excellence in isolated performance metrics doesn't guarantee battlefield success.